So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here to the lecture hall at the Bard Graduate Center, those of you who are in the room, those of you who are watching from elsewhere. As an institution that pays mind to the past as well as to its past, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that where we are on the island of Manhattan, Mannahatta, is the ancient ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, Lenape-Hoking. Also that we are here just a stone's throw from what was Seneca Village before Central Park was built, and more generally that New York has been a place of refuge of voluntary migrants and also those forced to come here in the past. None of us are forced to be here now. We are here on the contrary. In order to hear Dr. Brooke Penaloza-Patzak, who is an esteemed alumna of the Bard Graduate Center. She studied first for her BA ceramics at Alfred University, did an MA here at the BGC, and then moved on to the University of Vienna, where she obtained her PhD in history in 2018. She's held positions as predoctoral and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna and the Institute for Economic and Social History, and is currently a postdoctoral visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department for the History and Sociology of Science. She is currently the principal investigator of an Austrian Research Foundation research project entitled Beringian, Ancient Migration Data Collection and the Shape of Science, and that's being held from 2020 until 2023. She's been, before now, principal investigator on two other projects, first entitled With Objects at Hand, Specimen Collections, Transnational Networks, and the Disciplinary Coalescence of Anthropology, 1880 to 1933. And before that, Implementing Anthropology, the International Circulation of Scientists and Ethnographic Objects between North America, Austria, and Germany, 1873 to 1933. She has a number of publications just forthcoming to give you some sense of what she is working on, to be published in the Handbook on the History of the Human Sciences, which is published by Palgrave Macmillan, of Scientists and Specimens, Early Anthropology Networks in and Between Nations, and the Natural and Human Sciences, and in a volume entitled Science in the Metropolis, Capital Collections, Complex Systems, Vienna, Berlin, and the Ethnographic Specimen Exchange in Transnational Fin de Siècle Scientific Networks. And again, just for perspective, she's organized panels, one at the American Indian Workshop in Leiden, Communicating Things, Things Communicating, New Perspectives in Material Culture and Indigenous Studies, and at the 54th International Congress of Americanists in Vienna, the Museum as Forum during the 19th and 20th centuries. And I can't let go of the fact that we first met many, many years ago when Brooke was applying to this program. And we had a fascinating conversation in our interview about taxidermy, which was her subject and goal of work at the time. We then, I don't know how many years later, maybe 10 years later, had a scholar, Petra Bernd-Langt, actually speaking from this podium about taxidermy and material culture. It did strike me at the time it was a great subject. Later, while you were here, you worked with Aaron and me about Franz Boas and A.B. Warburg, and it's great to watch the way in which your career has evolved. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. The BGC is such a unique space for scholars from all different fields to come together to talk about how objects function in the world. So I'm so happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. The material I'll be presenting today is based on a chapter from my book project entitled With Objects at Hand. Broadly speaking, it explores how early ethnographic collections functioned as tools, laboratories, and training stations for remarkably heterogeneous constellations of researchers that came together in the interest of developing a natural science of human culture and the longer term legacies of these engagements within the history of science. I'll start with a quote. In 1867, German physician, explorer, and nascent father of German anthropology, Adolf Bastian, said of the Bering Strait that it was, quote, precisely there where Alaska's mountain ranges separate the hummingbirds that fly in on the warm Pacific currents from the walruses in the icy polar sea, that the four cardinal directions meet at an intimate crossroads. And it was here that a deeper knowledge of regional myths and linguistic relationships was highly desirable, for it was only these that could shed light on the prehistory of this corner of the earth and its inhabitants. In years to follow, Bastian's memorandum and others like it would help galvanize two interwoven strains of research. On the one hand, Beringia is a key location for investigation into ancient human migration, and on the other, the extent to which geography, climate, flora, and fauna, what some were beginning to refer to as the environment, was implicated in the development of human culture. To reformulate his words in terms of a collection mandate, you could read mountain ranges, the icy sea, hummingbirds, walruses, and myths as water samples, or sediment in water samples, animal skins, and ethnographic objects. The collections I'll discuss today were made between 1865 and 1907, but ancient migration is still a lively field of investigation, and new object-based research is constantly recalibrating what we think we know about when and how people first came to the Americas. And here are two finds from the last 12 months. This is so much fun because people are constantly sending me links and emails and articles and things. On the left, here's one of several circa 23,000-year-old footprints found in White Sands National Park, New Mexico. Up until recently, scientists believed the Americas were populated via Beringian or otherwise in the Holocene after the last glacial max. These footprints are being cited as evidence of inhabitation millennia earlier in the Pleistocene. And at the right, there's a 57,000-year-old mummified remains of a wolf pup found in Yukon territory. Her mitochondrial genome groups with an ancestor clade that's common to Eurasia and North America. And this is being cited as evidence that the mammoth slope existed much earlier than previously calculated. As these examples show, objects leveraged as data are often situated at the very crux of scientific knowledge formation. This is a pretty fascinating construction. At the fore is the specimen, ostensibly neutral and unencumbered by worldly interests, an objective veneer for the highly subjective work of specimen selection, translation into data, and data analysis. In other words, the relationship between researchers and the objects they use as data is complicated. And one of my aims is to develop a more detailed understanding of the intellectual processes and physical practices involved in making scientific knowledge from objects. My focus on the history of research into ancient migration offers a temporally and disciplinarily broad lens through which to track this process. Using the mollusk as an example in this presentation, I'll track one object type through 3 expeditions, showing how it entangled different practitioners, research questions, and fields of knowledge. I'll also suggest that the efficacy of an object as data at any given juncture is historically contingent and hinged on the availability, I mean, this is kind of obvious, but I'll work through this in a more meaningful way, and hinged on the availability of resources and frameworks, material, technological, intellectual, epistemic, and otherwise. So the question I'll begin unpacking today is, what can data election practices in the history of research into ancient Beringian migration tell us about the role of objects in how knowledge works in the world? This is an overview. I'll first just go over my aims and methods. I'll move on to a historical overview of Beringia as a biogeographic, political, and economic space, Beringia and the history of scientific inquiry into ancient human migration. Then I'll have my 3 case studies, and then I'll conclude with some preliminary thoughts on what this says about how objects work in the world in terms of knowledge formation. Historians of science have long been interested in objects, epistemic and otherwise, yet there are few models with which to track what happens between the people who produce knowledge and the objects they use to produce it. I'll do this by zeroing in on a broadly applicable object-based practice on the one hand and a specific line of inquiry on the other. My object-related practice is simply that of using objects as data, and my line of inquiry is ancient human migration to the Americas. This foregrounds entanglements between practitioners and objects in different time periods, geographic areas, and fields of knowledge. The intention is to, on one hand, begin thinking about how different technologies and political, social, and economic engagements inform practitioners' object-based research. And on the other, to gain a more elaborate understanding of what researchers' use of objects as scientific data can tell us about the entanglements between research questions, methods, and disciplines. My interest here is not in the top-down sense of disciplinary inculcation within constantly bounded scientific fields, but rather in scientific fields as highly permeable and interdependent areas of activity, linked in dialogue about the prospects and limitations of using different kind of objects as data. In this scenario, the significance of objects is often contested, and the object interpretation is inevitably subject to a revision and renegotiation. This is a bottom-up perspective that attends to chance and opportunity, and in which the individuals, objects they use as data, and ways in which they go about engaging that data all contribute to larger scale scientific transformation. Here is one of my favorite couples right now, Dina Brodsky-Jochimsen and Waldemar Jochimsen from circa 1900 in Siberia. They're conducting research for the Jessup expedition, which I'll discuss a bit later. At the time this image was taken, she's working towards her PhD in physical anthropology in Zurich, and he trained as a rabbinical scholar and then a shoemaker and machinist, but turned to ethnography during a 10-year stint in Siberian exile as a result of involvement with a socialist revolutionary group. This image captures something of the travails of object-based research. Here they are in their work tent, crowded by working materials and the objects they collected: pens and notebooks, graduated cylinders, photographic plates, a coiled basket, silver teacup, and a saucer. Here for collection context is Brodsky-Jochimsen in the entryway of their dugout among the Koryak, meters off the Pacific Ocean. In her hand is also a beaker, to the left their pet dog and the work tent we just saw from the interior. Now for a very brief historical overview of Beringia as a biogeographic, political, and economic space, and a locus of research in the ancient human migration. Here's a contemporary map. So Beringia is delimited by the Lena River in the west, Mackenzie River to the east, Chukchi Sea in the north, and the tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula in the south. Its distance from major urban centers long rendered it a subject of scholarly conjecture. So Moscow and St. Petersburg are, just for reference, like 3,000 miles away. And then Kyoto and Tokyo are over 1,500 miles away. In the mid-1500s, indigenous communities began working with freelance Russian trappers and merchants in what eventually became an international maritime fur trade. First sable and fox, later beaver and sea otter. Still, the region remained largely uncharted until the 18th century. In 1799, current-day Alaska became a Russian territory. This mid-19th century Russian-American souvenir card is one in a series of 82, advertising the empire's provinces. The emphasis here is economic, with special attention to natural resources, and again, this notion of an interdependence of nature and culture. An Arctic fox in its summer morph exemplifies trapping. We see the words highly substantial foreign trade scrawled along the side of the same card, and a trapper with a raised spear at the lower right. In 1867, Russia sold the province to the US for $7 million, plus $200,000 to absolve land claims from fur traders and ice corporations. The Russian Empire deployed its first scientific expeditions to its far eastern territories in 1725. Led by Bering, the principal aim of the first and second Kamchatka expeditions was to investigate if Asia and the Americas were in fact contiguous. So this is something that remained unknown for quite some time. The team returned to St. Petersburg with a negative on this point and a great deal of new information about the empire's far eastern resources, geography, and human populations. Subsequent researchers relied heavily on the Kamchatka reports as an important source of information about Russia's coastal peoples. In the mid-19th century, new archaeological finds and the realization that the Bering Strait was in principle traversable by canoe stirred up scholarly interest in questions of ancient trans-Pacific migration and Native American origins. These topics appear in a vast array of publications of the day, from zoological and political treatises to geographic, anthropological, and ethnological, and helped galvanize the 1873 establishment of the Interdisciplinary International Congress of Americanists. Long-standing debates regarding human origins and the grounds for and mechanics behind physical and cultural differentiation notwithstanding, a thread shared by several popular theories was that humans had moved into the Americas by way of Asia across the Bering Strait. From Immanuel Kant to Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and Thomas Jefferson, a common sentiment was that, quote, the resemblance between the Indians of America and the eastern inhabitants of Asia would induce us to conjecture that the former are the descendants of the latter, or the latter of the former. And of course, these speculations carried weighty implications for highly debated issues of the day, in particular, the cultural and political status of Native Americans, their claims to the land, and ultimately place within a hierarchical classifications of the world, so-called types or races, as well as the nature of the relationship between the environment and living organisms on one hand, and the environment and culture on the other. Eminent physicians like Jeffries Wyman and Rudolf Virchow attempted to elaborate on these causal or casual morphological appraisals with more systematic anthropometric research, but soon reached an impasse. There was simply not enough data upon which to base their studies. At the same time, morphology, the study of form, was, as Lynn Neihart has shown, becoming one of the leading 19th century streams of natural science investigation. With so many early contributors to anthropology embedded in the natural sciences, morphological thinking had a profound impact on developing frameworks for understanding the relationship between people and their surroundings and current and past populations. It also introduced a problematic that would linger for more than a century to come. If one could trace biological kinship via analyses of human form, was it likewise possible to track cultural contact via the morphology of ethnographic objects? And what, moreover, was at stake in this methodological conflation of biology and culture? By the 1880s, a diverse and international jumble of scholars had converged on Beringia in search of evidence of ancient migration. Now with this, we come to section 4. I'll be talking about objects collected within 3 well-publicized expeditions, or at least at that time. The Russian-American Telegraph Expedition, the Pacific Northwest Coast and Bering Strait Expedition, and the Jessup North Pacific Expedition. We'll begin with William Healy Dahl's collection from the Russian-American Telegraph Expedition of 1865 to 67, which was inaugurated by the Western Union to explore the feasibility of connecting the US with Russia and Europe via telegraph lines across the strait, or actually dug underneath the strait. Dahl, who was a student of Louis Agassiz and Jeffries Wyman, would go on to help develop natural history and anthropological classification at the Smithsonian Institution, and signed on as a member of the scientific corps to conduct geographic surveys and collect in Russian America. This page from his catalog of natural history specimens details a cross-disciplinary collection of objects gathered from along the Bering Strait. We have mammals, deer horns, seal bones, dog skulls are listed alongside plants. There's a box of lichen and moss, algae, and a sponge, as well as land snails, insects, fossils, birds, and fish. And Dahl didn't limit himself to just natural history or Russian America. He also collected ethnographic data, including the deerskin hood here, and crossed the strait to collect in Kamchatka, Russia. Naturalist though he was, Dahl was also drawn to the subject of ancient human settlement, and in 1875 published this map of the distribution of tribes in Alaska, which likewise, as you can see, attends to settlements along the Russian coast. And this is where his story gets very interesting. As a result of inclement weather during the expedition, he was often subject to what he referred to as enforced intervals of leisure, and spent his time pursuing his life's passion, which is the study of mollusks. On the lower right is one of the many specimens that he illustrated during this time. And he didn't just study live mollusks. During his time in the Aleutian Islands, he also turned his attention to shell heaps, also known as shell mounds or middens. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with what these are, they're essentially dumps in which prehistoric communities disposed of refuse, including the shells of the mollusks that formed an important part of ancient coastal diets. He was interested in these for two reasons. First of all, I think kind of the beginning impetus for his interest in them was that they gave insight into the area's prehistoric mollusk populations. Second, he considered shell heap placement, composition, and stratification useful sources of data for tracking the distribution and duration of prehistoric human settlement. So in this context, the shell becomes a really fascinating object that's activated in Dahl's time off from his geo and hydrographic research. The conclusions he drew from working with live and refuse shells bridged nature and culture and his own time in prehistory. And he used these objects as data to begin postulating about ancient human migration. Not long after his return from Beringian, Dahl was confident enough in his data to state that, quote, "I see no reason for disputing the hypothesis that America was populated from Asia. The northern route was clearly by way of the Bering Strait." And something crucial to note here, and something that I still need to spend some time unpacking, is that in the course of recasting the shell as an object of cultural rather than natural history, Dahl also projected a neo-Lamarckian notion of biological development onto cultural differentiation and human migration. And this is something I'd be very happy to talk more about later. Moving on, 16 years later, from 1882 to 1881, brothers Arl and Arthur Krause set out for the Pacific Northwest coast and Bering Strait on behalf of Bremen's Geographical Society. Both had studied natural history and taught botany, zoology, and chemistry at a secondary school in Berlin. They were hired to conduct geographic, natural, and ethnographic surveys of the region and stopped in at the Smithsonian en route to confer with Dahl, who had by this point become an eminent expert on Alaska. We have few published sources on their collections, and my own research with their material has unfortunately been delayed, but we do know that, like Dahl, they also assembled a cross-disciplinary collection that stretched far beyond their fields of specialization. Arthur is credited with the bulk of natural and geographic data collection, which includes a herbarium, mosses, liverworts, bird skins, insects, mammoth bones, and fossils from the Quaternary. And Arl conducted the bulk of anthropological data collection, with a special concentration on linguistic, ethnographic, and anthropometric material from the Tlingit, which is a First Nations group that was at that point living on the southern strip along the Alaskan coast. In an interesting twist, considering that they had no history of work with mollusks, the brothers also brought together a significant malacological collection and, thanks in part to Dahl, were able to identify a new species of land snail that inhabited both sides of the Beringian Strait or the Bering Strait. They could have easily cited this as evidence of migration. Indeed, Dahl did as much in his reports of their findings, but Arthur never broached the subject in print. Their foray into malacology and familiarity with Dahl's work notwithstanding, the Krause's expertise did not situate them to recognize shells as a potential source of data on human culture. And this is where we find an almost poetic example of what I was mentioning at the outset with regard to kind of data fails in the face of incommensurability with researcher experience or expectations. Of curious accumulations encountered in the vicinity of where Dahl had found shell heaps the year before, the Krauses remarked only, quote, "Countless shells lay on the beach. In some areas, they seemed to have been thrown by human hands into a pile, which was all the more striking because up until that point, we had yet to experience the natives collecting mussels for sustenance," unquote. Thanks to Dahl's work, we know that these were almost certainly prehistoric shell heaps. and little indicative of the lives of the people that the Krauses encountered. Neither of the brothers ever published a statement on the possibility of an east-to-west migration, human or otherwise. And as Arl put it in the foreword of his 1885 monograph on the Tlingit, it was a matter of data, or rather lack thereof. His year-long trip had precluded extensive comparative research among the inhabitants of the Russian coast, and thus he didn't consider himself qualified to comment on the subject. In ensuing years, Arl became more vocal about the general absence of data suggesting ancient migration in the region, and intended to present a paper on the topic at the 1888 International Congress of Americanists. As he put it to a young Franz Boas, quote, "I critique the superficial notions that would like to at once assume the most intimate of relations between Northwest Coast Americans and Asians on the basis of a few comparative instances, and without any regard for the insufficiency of our knowledge," unquote. And with this, I'll transition to my final case study, which is the Jessup North Pacific Expedition, directed by Boas from 1897 to 1902. Long story short, American Museum of Natural History President Morris K. Jessup, or Boas, convinced him that research into the increasingly high-profile questions of Native American origins and the historical relation between Asia and America would earn the AMNH unqualified standing in scientific circles, and Jessup personally agreed to underwrite the expedition. Boas had been in correspondence with Dahl and the Krauses about their research since the mid-1880s, when he was training in Berlin under Adolf Bastian, who was this opening quote with the hummingbirds and the warm Pacific current and the walruses in the icy polar sea. Boas advertised the Jessup expedition's novel contributions as an explicitly comparative scope, systematic analysis, and an express concentration on ancient human migration. The expedition employed over 20 field workers in all. Their areas of collection and expertise, which were often but not always related, extended from physical anthropology, carried out by Brodsky Jochelsson at the upper left and Boas center right, to ethnology, carried out by her husband Vardemar Jochelsson, middle left, and George Hunt and Boas at the upper right, archaeology, carried out by Harlan Ingersoll Smith, and biology, carried out by Norman G. Buxton, who's right here. Here is a represented handful of the thousands of units they collected: anthropometric measurements, photographs and headcasts, human skeletal material, ethnographic and linguistic material. At the upper right were the silver teacup and coil basket in the earlier photo, which is still in the collection. I was very gratified to be able to find. Wax cylinder recordings, face painting and tattooing templates, archaeological material from shell heaps, and here's a shell heap dig in progress here. Plant and pigment samples, bird, fish, and mammal skins. This superabundance of material notwithstanding, quotidian factors like personal attributes, collection biases, and data availability rendered a truly comparative collection of material from either side of the strait impracticable and culminated in a failure of the intended comparative method. Both Jochelsons, for instance, scoured the Kamchatka Peninsula for human-made objects from the Pleistocene that could be used in comparison with the objects that Smith had found in North America, but there wasn't anything to be found. What's more, each of the researchers' published analyses of their data were indeed systematic, but Boas never kind of created a comparative synthesis of the individual reports, which and therefore it was never possible to really tease out any concrete or undisputable evidence of human migration or lack of human migration. Or at least Boas didn't think it was safe to do. AMNH zoologist J.A. Allen, who wrote up the reports on the animals collected in Siberia, had a different perspective, however. Just 1 year after the specimens had made their way into the museum, he confidently stated that, quote, "A close interrelationship between the boreal mammals inhabiting the two continents is beyond question. A relationship so intimate that it could only have been brought about by a former land bridge connecting the two areas." I have yet to locate any comment by Boas on Allen's statement, which is quite interesting because he has a huge body of correspondence. So his silence, in a way, says something. Still, in a 1911 address as retiring president of the New York Academy of Sciences, Boas permitted himself a flight of fancy in which he cited no specific data, but mused that the, quote, tendency to parallel modification of the European, East Asiatic, and some American types indicates early relationship, unquote. Boas didn't publish his second paper on the subject until nearly 20 years later. And it's difficult to ignore a slight yet crucial shift in perspective. He had begun to doubt whether, in fact, morphological analyses of any variety served to track ancient migration. Form alone might allow researchers to track movement, but it did not suffice to illuminate the equally critical issue of the time at which that movement had taken place. As he put it, quote, even the most carefully investigated finds are not distinguishable in technical character from those of the modern Indian, and there's an apparent contradiction between the paleontological evidence and types of implements found. What's more, the geological position of animal and human remains suggests a much later date of extinction than is usually assumed. In other words, the data just did not compute. And with that, he effectively handed off the investigation to another field, maintaining that, quote, the final determination of the problem of the first arrival of man on our continent will be solved by geologists. And with that, I'll move on to some preliminary thoughts on the role of objects in how knowledge works in the world. First, close attention to data election and use can help us track how and why specific research questions travel from one scientific field to another. In this case, for instance, anthropological research into the potential Asian origin of Native Americans was embedded within and buoyed by a longer and transdisciplinary history of geographic and natural history investigation in the region. Second, data election practices have the potential to become linked with specific scientific methods, modes of analysis, and/or epistemologies. Disentangling the interdependencies of these elements can help us plot and track critical junctures in the transfer of knowledge over time. And here I'll cite the example of Dahl recasting the shell as an object of cultural rather than natural history. This is an incredibly important moment for me because for decades now, we've known from scientists writing that they were projecting biological evolutionary theories onto the study of cultural data. But this offers us insight into how this transfer, or maybe conflation, operated in practice and in the course of work with objects, which is vital for tracing the real impact of these ideas on how we understand human difference up until today. Finally, serviceable data helps answer research questions and smooths the way towards new areas of knowledge creation. When these data choices resurface in auxiliary fields of investigation, it can also indicate transdisciplinary epistemological and/or methodological exchange. Data that proves itself unsuited to answering a given research question presents an obstacle and takes on an element of precarity. These failures are also important because they tell us a great deal about researchers' implicit assumptions regarding how that data was expected to behave. This, in turn, reveals something about the intellectual and social engagements and scientific worlds within those researchers are embedded or seek to embed themselves. Case in point, and as noted throughout my talk with Dahl, Virchow, and others who had enlisted objects as data to gain insight into ancient migration across Beringia, had largely relied on morphology as an analytical lens. Boas had initially presumed that he too would be able to do the same with the data from the Jessup expedition. This shift had pretty monumental implications for the utility of extant and future data collection in his time, particularly in the field of ethnology. The assumption driving the large-scale collection of ethnographic objects since the 1860s had been that comparative morphological analyses would at some future point help researchers elucidate the historical movements of and relationships between the world's peoples. And if this premise was no longer tenable, then what of the millions of objects stockpiled in museums across Europe and the Americas? Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Those of you who are watching from somewhere else, you can send them in through the Q&A function. And those of you here in the room can use your biological hand. Can I just start with a question? I just want to start right at the end with the fate of morphology. So is it only because of this particular story, or would you say more generally that Boaz is responsible for letting go of morphology? And why?
Can I piggyback my question on that? Because I think the answer may be parallel. And so my question also, I have another question, but this question has to do with where the questions of morphology having to do with the ethnographic collections that Boaz was primarily interested in, and the morphology of the shells and the natural history collections, and the issue of race comes in, and that where Boaz's early potential interest in morphology, thinking about shells and rattles maybe, was complicated by the role of morphology and physiology in the sort of racial sciences that Boaz was so sort of involved in critiquing. And so where does, I mean, the question is, where does race play a role in the answer to Peter's question?
Well, and the answer is a huge role, especially as we're moving into the 1920s and 30s. And in terms, so in terms of, early on, Boaz's training in the Berlin Ethnographic Museum, where a lot of the people he is training are natural scientists, and it's just kind of natural that it's, I'm still unseen exactly where this belief came. You could understand objects in the same way that you were understanding shells, but I believe it was part of the legitimization process of getting, if anthropology was going to be a natural science, which it had to be in order to be legitimated, you had to take on a lot of these ideas and speak the language and or embed epistemology. The epistemology somehow had to match, and I think for Boaz, what's happening by the time this second quote comes from is, first of all, morphology has been completely discredited by, like, let's say 1900. Lynn Neihart has written a wonderful book on this. I think it came out in 1995 or something like this, about how it's really, we consider this fallen, completely illegitimate enterprise, but in the 19th century, it was part of all of the natural sciences. And so what happens when anthropology is a natural science and it kind of like branches off, is that they miss that memo, that's kind of like, or they kind of ignore it, that it's like, oh yeah, no, we're not, that doesn't work anymore. And so a lot of anthropologists are still, first of all, these huge collections that they've made within the past 20 or 30 years, spent a ton of money on, erected huge museums to house. So what are you supposed to do with that data? This is still a question. And so I think that you kind of just let it ride and don't say much about it. And it's pretty to look at, so you go look at it. And now we're figuring out new things to do with it. But for Boaz especially, his work in physical anthropology and his real dedication to race science, what my hunch is, and I'm hesitant to say it on any kind of recording, but this is something I'm still working out, is that he had to kind of choose one or the other. It was not tenable to keep, and what was more important at this point was to kind of destroy the pseudoscience that was kind of decaying, this racial science that was kind of like drawing the truth, or what they saw as science, what he and colleagues saw as scientific truth and lifeblood out of science. It was important to cut it off there, and that meant abandoning morphological research with ethnographic collections, which there are some arguments that is still useful, then so be it. I hope that answers that question.
So I'm going to jump back, sorry, because I'm not sure that it's fair to say that anthropology missed the boat. That everybody was discrediting morphology by 1900 and the anthropologists were asleep. Because just take the example of Spengler, whose whole Decline of the West is a morphological view of human history.
All right, you're right. You're right. The kind of anthropologists that Boas wanted to affiliate himself with were.
So then it comes back to, again, how fair is it to take Boas as standing in for all of anthropology, or is he a special case?
I mean, I think he is in some senses a special case, but he and colleagues okay, so there's definitely a very strong, we were talking about this a little bit before the talk, a strong pull of socially minded liberal anthropologists that are dead set on trying to dismantle increasingly what they see as increasingly malignant race sciences from about 1910 up until my work ends in 1933. And these people, and it's a big network of people, and it's not just scientists, it's a lot of I wrote an article about the Emergency Society for German and Austrian Science and Art, which is getting funding from completely normal people, just living in a lot of people in New York. But I do not think it certainly was not just OS. There was a lot of other researchers in a lot of other fields that were very dedicated to dismantling this. But then there was, of course, also a lot of anthropologists that were involved in, and also I'd say didn't maybe see the dangers of morphological thinking and racialized thinking until far later. I mean, even in 1922, Boas is part of an organization that funds Eugene Fisher's research, which of course you would think is almost impossible, but looking back, it is. But at that time, Fisher's a young guy that's put out a couple of articles that are kind of questionable, but there's this hope that you can kind of show him, a different way. Yeah.
Other questions?
I'm sort of still parsing this one together, but what is the danger of turning natural objects into cultural objects?
In and of itself, there's of course no danger. It's that when you want to look at biological development, which especially at this time is like very, it's understood as being very deterministic. If you want to put that same lens on culture, it can be incredibly dangerous because, I didn't have time to go into it, but for Dahl, he has this like very detailed hierarchy of, or he's like, within 2 years, he develops this very detailed hierarchy of people involved in, or like the cultural groups involved in migrating across Beringia, and this is, it's not at all it's in a sense very looting, and it is saying that let's say the Inuit have are essentially less developed than European Americans, and will always stay at that point because, the same way that one of his mollusks, developed to this certain point. It's just a different species, and so that's why it's that way. And so I think that kind of thinking is incredibly dangerous when you start looking at cultural difference in all also biological or in humans.
Mhm.
But this is all very new at that time, so they're still parsing out like what that means.
Thank you.
I'll ask my other question if nobody else is. Do you have
question.
someone from the
I have
Zoom is here?
Ivan from his office. Hi there. Could you say a little more about Adolf Bastian's place in your account?
Yeah, I mean, Peter and I were talking about this before. Bastian is, I think he's a fascinating figure. You know, he's now considered the father of German anthropology. In as far as I can tell, he deserves a great deal of credit for kind of getting the anthropological project in Germany off its feet. And since Germany at that point was kind of so influential internationally, a lot of ideas go back to him. His own ideas, kind of the farther back you trace them, are also very, very heavily influenced by Humboldt. So, you know, it's so that that's something that needs more research. And then Humboldt, of course, there's this great paper called, I think, Is Humboldt Derivative, which also argues, you know, it's kind of intellectual history of how that goes. So to just give Bastian credit is not fair. He's part of a huge network of scholars that are very important in terms of the development of German anthropology. But you know, he's one guy that writes prolifically, has a ton of money at his disposal in terms of collections, and he can pretty much make any collection he wants happen. Which Aaron knows a great deal about, the Northwest Coast expedition with Adrian Jacobsen he funded, and one thing that and so then Bastian also for years he's had this interest in the Bering Strait region. He funds this huge expedition to the Northwest Coast, which is wildly successful. Has, you know, ends up having one of the best, or you know, it gets him a wonderful reputation. He also then directly thereafter, which is something that has received very little attention, I'm not sure why, commissioned a collection on the other side of the strait. So in a sense, I do believe it was intended, these two together were intended as comparative, but there's nothing written about that at all. So it's something I'm still working on. And then Boaz is the scientific assistant in charge of processing the collection, and he and other colleagues are very upset with how little information about the collection has come in. This is also something Aaron knows a great deal about, come in, and kind of what you see in their letters between each other are that this dissatisfaction leads Boaz to suggest another much larger, more scientific expedition, which Bastian won't fund. And so, in a sense, and this is in 1884 or 85, Boaz doesn't get a permanent position in Europe. He goes to the US kind of with this wish that, and Bastian's always kind of like in the background being like, yeah, if you can get money from somewhere, you know, like we'll support you a little bit. And he's constantly in communication with Bastian. So even at that point when he's in America, I think Bastian still, in a sense, is very involved in the working out of the Bering Strait region as a point of migration. And Dahl is also a very important figure, and I have yet to understand the kind of full implications of that. But Dahl was the one who kind of tipped Bastian off to this in the, I think, early 1860s. And he's a really interesting figure that I don't think so much has been written about. So that's also something that is important to understand, will be important to understand more thoroughly.
I think too, Bastian's notion of what role history plays in the development of culture becomes very influential on Boaz, and becomes one of these criteria for saying, human-made objects change over time for different reasons than natural forms change over time. And that different reason is they're made by humans who intervene in morphological transformation in a way that there's no active agent intervening in biological transformation in the same, so and history, which I think he gets in part from Bastian, is sort of
his colleague Grünwedel for that, which is like in the preface of the Jessup expedition. This is like one of the few places. There's this fellow that kind of falls out of favor in the 1920s in Germany, so you really see Boas citing him pretty much never. But that is the one thing that he credits was like showing him history and I think what's happening is that Bastian has all these theoretical ideas about how this should function, but Grünwedel is one in the collection with him, showing him how you're supposed to actually make that manifest.
See that in
itself.
collections.
Yeah,
that's very interesting. Can I ask my other question? Nobody else, anyone lined up on Zoom? So my other question, which is sort of more general, has to do with the potential, the kind of potential convergence of some ways of thinking in STS, especially sort of Latourian vector network theory for this kind of work, which is to say that the natural forms and the cultural forms and the people who collect and put them into relationship with one another are all players in knowledge production. I'm interested in the kind of potential convergences of that sort of set of ideas with the current discourses of sort of traditional ecological knowledge coming out, from indigenous peoples and indigenous ontologies, which challenge not only the nature-culture distinction, but the subject-object distinction in ways that could be seen to harmonize with some of the sort of STS views. But I'm wondering about the problem of terminology that, we talk about, like, I'd see there'd be a tendency of saying, they were, in the past, they were sort of reducing, in terms of indigenous people, they were sort of reducing culture to nature, right? By saying that indigenous people evolve like other forms do, and there's a path and there's limits, and, there's a kind of reduction of culture to nature. And then there's the sort of transformations of nature to culture that we saw with Dahl and the shell. But then we slip back into using nature and culture as opposing concepts, which, from my reading of it, a lot of that STS and indigenous kind of conceptualization is trying to challenge at the base. So, is there a limitation to thinking about objects and data when also trying to think outside of that language that we've inherited, that Bruno Latour has tried to help us dismantle a bit?
That's a really good question that I came across something just even yesterday as I was reading that made me realize how old-fashioned it was to think of like environment and an object being different from its environment in this way that kind of because maybe there's not necessarily a huge distinction between those things. And that's something I have to spend so much more time. And for me, that was kind of like a moment of being like, oh yeah, I know that this nature culture divide is something for them that's very important. That's very clear. And I need to do more work in terms of historically, culturally situating that and understanding exactly what that means, and also what that means for me writing about that. Yeah, and that's about as far as I can go into that. This is kind of like a little flash of insight I had yesterday, but I was like, unfortunately, I don't think it's like very satisfying. But it is something that's on my radar that's kind of it's starting to marinate somewhere.
Any other questions? No, if not, we thank you very much.
Thank you.